My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, here once again with Game Director Ian Hazzikostas. Ian, thank you so much for coming on once again.
Hey Josh, happy 2019.
Happy 2019.
Another year, another Q&A.
Yes, exactly. One per year. That's what we're
exactly.
I'm just kidding. So we actually have a ton of questions. I'm really excited to get to the answers of here.
Yeah, all the hard-hitting questions. We're gonna get pet battles in. We're gonna get clipping issues on helms.
Oh, shut the fuck up.
Okay.
No, yeah. In all seriousness, I think we pretty much have a hit list of the most upvoted questions and all the hot topics that.
Okay, so they're gonna answer my question this time.
Sorry.
This is what I deal with.
This is gonna be crazy.
Okay,
I can't believe they're gonna answer my question.
It's so hard not to troll. I'm sorry.
It is. It really is. Let's go to this first question.
Keep doing it, Ian.
Speaking of
I
trolls,
like that.
From Mamea. Yeah, that's actually a good transition. Asking any specifics for the release time frame of Kultirans and Zandalari.
So, yes, the day that patch 815 comes out. So, as people have seen on the 815 PTR right now, the allied races are available there. Their acquisition quest lines are testable. The requirements for accessing the Kultiran and Zandalari are finishing the war campaign through the Tides of Vengeance step, which gives you the achievement. That's before going into the raid. It's earnable right now as of the start of the new season and the opening of Battle of Dazar'alor. It's exalted rep with either Tiragard or
but when's the patch? That is true.
Just having done your content quest line. You can accomplish all of those things today.
That's
the
true.
second 815 drops, you'll log in and have the quest waiting for you to get your allied race unlocked.
That's good.
Now, why not sooner? Two reasons. One, part of it is a reflection of the story.
Keep people subbed.
The plot of Battle for Azeroth thus far has been about not just meeting and befriending these allied races, but truly getting them to a point where there's a close enough bond that they're willing to join the alliance, to join the horde, to take part in this larger war that spans the globe, and that comes after some key events like what we're seeing in Battle of Dazar'alor right now that really forge that bond.
Okay.
That's the story reason.
Okay.
The practical reason. Now, so
keep them
folks
subbed.
may remember back at BlizzCon about a year and a few months ago, when we announced allied races for the first time, we announced Zandalari and Dark Iron Dwarves. The actual original intent was to have Zandalari and Dark Iron as the two allied races at launch in Battle for Azeroth. Notably missing from that is
times change. That's
because we didn't actually know or think that we were going to be able to do Kultiran practically. Making a new race is one of the most time-consuming things we can do from an artistic perspective. It actually takes up like a gigantic portion of the entire manpower that we have available for making an expansion. And with the allied races, we wanted to make a bunch of new races rather than just a single one. And yes, people have noticed that most of them are variants on existing races. We get custom animations for them, change some of their anims, change aspects of them, but we're not making it from scratch, which is part of what enables us to actually get the wide range that we have done.
Great.
Kultiran are an exception. The Kultiran is actually a completely new model, completely new skeleton, new rig, and animating terms. And it's actually every bit as costly from an art perspective as, let's say, the Pandaren was back in Mists of Pandaria. So when we looked at that, we didn't think we were going to be able to do it. We thought, because it's actually literally more time-consuming than all the other allied races combined in terms of our art resources.
Wow.
And so we were proceeding with, well, it would be really nice to have Kultirans in here, but we don't think we can do this. And so that was the plan we had in mind at BlizzCon.
Okay.
As development of Battle for Azeroth went on, we felt increasingly bad about that because it felt like really it's what the story deserved. The whole story was about befriending the Zandalari, befriending the Kultirans. Why not have both? We realized that if we stretched, we could get the Kultiran done, but that it wasn't going to be able to happen until 815. And once we knew we were going to do that, it really made sense to pair the Kultiran and the Zandalari. So basically, Horde players who are waiting on Zandalari trolls, you can blame the Alliance, and blame us, because that's really how all this works. But that's the full backstory. That's why we were always hesitant to ever announce something, let alone at BlizzCon, and then walk it back or delay it in any way.
They just answered the question.
We wanted to do right by both factions, and once we knew we were going to have Kultiran in their full glory, we wanted to be able to pair that with Zandalari, because that's really what fits the story and what makes sense there.
Okay, cool. And then,
that's an actual...
Mag'har was always the plan to happen at some point also. It just kind of was flipping them around.
Exactly. The original plan had been Mag'har in 815, and so we just pulled those back and made them available right at the start, Zandalari in 815 instead.
Okay, perfect. One other thing that you mentioned that I just do want to hammer home, because I've seen a ton of questions about it, is that you don't have to do the raid to unlock these allied races.
Oh, the Care Bears.
We've used phrases like it requires the Battle of Dazar'alor to be open. in the past, which
play
is
with other people.
that's because everything was sort of timed to become available.
Yeah, it's basically
time.
it's the 4th chapter of the Tides of Vengeance war campaign, which is like what sends you into like what's basically the preparations immediately preceding the raid.
Really sorry about
That's when the
that sound,
achievement
guys.
fires. That's all you
Really
need to do.
apologize.
Yep. Cool. All right, moving on. Next question comes from Colin the Tank, who says,
Okay.
Can you explain the rationale behind Alliance getting the opportunity for eye level 400 gear this week, and likely every week for engaging in world PvP?
That's right.
So a couple
get 'em
things.
to do it.
First off, we actually genuinely don't think this is going to be every week. I think we've seen a lot of increasing participation from the
don't think
Alliance
it
and
is.
narrowing the gap in participation in Warmode
Okay.
since Tides of Vengeance launched.
So it worked.
And the quest is only going to be offered when there is a significant disparity. So the goal is for this to eventually stop being offered. That said, a couple pieces.
So that means I'm getting 3 full 100 gear.
So why does this exist in the first place? Well, we added the increased bonus rewards
Fuck yeah.
for Alliance or for the outnumbered faction, going
That
up to
being
30% to get more of the outnumbered faction to opt into war mode. But we also realized that to some extent we needed to get Horde, some players, to consider turning off war mode. Now,
Got
that
it.
sounds maybe jarring up front, but what we saw in terms of our data was
Okay.
right when Battle for Azeroth launched,
Oh, Warmode too.
the ratio between Alliance and Horde was actually pretty close to even. It wasn't dead even, but it was actually close and competitive. There were some challenges with the way our shard matchmaking was working that led to Horde outnumbering Alliance in a lot of situations
That was with like the pre-made
early
groups
on.
thing.
But by the time we fixed those, we'd seen 2 trends emerging. Alliance, who felt outnumbered, were turning off war mode increasingly, but more and
Yeah.
more Horde were turning it on. Because they didn't. Now these weren't people who opted into war mode on day one.
I
but
said
once
this was
word
gonna
got
happen.
out that hey, there's just a free 10% rewards
I
waiting
said it
for
was
you.
gonna happen.
Just turn this on. You had tons of folks
Yep.
who really weren't interested in world PvP at all, and actually maybe very averse to world PvP, who were just in the habit of having war mode on, because well, why not? It's 10% free rewards. By incentivizing Alliance not just to go do their world quests in war mode, but to actually hunt the more numerous faction,
Yeah, I got actual.
that
interest.
actually helps get the balance to a better place on both sides.
Okay.
The goal here is to create a mode that offers fun and engaging world PvP for those who are interested in it, while compensating folks for the inefficiency that comes
Right.
with getting into world PvP while you're trying to get your world quests
makes
done or
sense.
go to a dungeon or whatnot.
Sounds good.
Yeah, like the point of the increased rewards isn't just for having check a box in an interface thing. It's because
It takes
you're going
longer.
to have the inefficiencies from having world
Yeah.
PvP involved.
Duh.
When we have an environment where there's no world PvP, but you're getting the increased rewards anyway, that's kind of a problem.
Exactly. Now, we do think that eye level 400 may actually be a bit too high. So when we first introduced this quest in Tides of Vengeance, it gave heroic raid quality gear, which at
What
the
do you
time was
mean?
eye level 370 heroic Uldir level gear. That made sense 3 months into Uldir, when there was a certain level of overall gear in the player base as a whole at max level, and that really was what was required for it to be exciting as an incentive at all.
Okay.
Now, that's very different, I think, at the start of a new raid tier. And when
Right.
most people haven't set foot in Heroic Battle of Zandalari yet, let alone really killed more than
Are
the
they
first
gonna
few
hotfix
bosses,
the item level?
getting an eye level 400 piece just from this quest is probably over-rewarding and actually risks undermining other core activities, not just raiding, but also Mythic Plus, also rated PvP. So, obviously, we're not going to change anything out from under players this week, but what we're thinking is that next week, if a faction is outnumbered significantly, this quest will give a 385 piece, but we're probably going to add something else to the pot, like some conquest points, to incentivize the core PvP gameplay there.
385?
To get it to a place where it still hopefully feels rewarding, but isn't overwhelming rewards from other sources.
Okay.
Come on.
We actually have a similar question about war mode. I'm just going to move right on to it. It comes from Abruek, who says, seeing as the war mode bonus has been an unwavering 30% for the Alliance, does the team consider this to be a failure at balancing?
Yeah.
So you were saying just a second ago that we're actually starting to see some of the benefits from the war mode bonus coming in.
Yeah, so it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, basically the answer to this is a lot of what I said in response to the last question. It wouldn't surprise me if we actually see that buff tick down to 25% in coming weeks in some regions, maybe even as soon as next week. The way it works, essentially, it's a sliding
only
scale
25%.
where if things are roughly balanced, it's going to be 10% for both sides, up in increments of 5% to a maximum of 30% if the imbalance is severe. Since Tides of Vengeance, we've actually seen this system be very effective at increasing participation in war mode from the outnumbered faction and really just narrowing the gap. It was
smart.
Honestly,
it was a good idea.
the gap is half of what it was when Tides of Vengeance came out.
There it is.
And I think players who participate in War Mode, I think, can probably universally attest. If you were Horde especially, you probably didn't see a whole lot of Alliance when you were out questing. That has not been the case lately, and we view that as a success. So
yes.
I think with regard to the specific question, I think we do view it as a failure from a few months ago, and I think this is fixing that mistake and getting things back on track to a place where there is activity, there is actual PvP happening in our PvP mode.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Good.
Moving on. Next question from Dradeka, I think is how I'll pronounce that, who says, I've greatly enjoyed the 30% bonus as Alliance for War Mode and almost never take it off. There's a lot of excitement when battles organically occur. However, the server lag is almost unbearable. Is anything being done about server stability? So obviously we've been, on our end, we've been talking a lot about server stability over the last couple of weeks. Last couple of months now, I guess, basically since launch. What's going on there? I know we've done some stuff already, but
this is a top priority for our server team and our engineering team as a whole. We understand that nothing else in the game really matters if the game physically feels like it's not performance, like you're playing, you're just kind of stuck in mud when you're trying to get spells off or interact with the world around you, let alone fight the other faction.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
It's a top priority. Unfortunately, with things like this, with performance improvements, it's rarely a single silver bullet or a single giant problem we just need to find and solve. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And so there's been ongoing work, particularly since Tides of Vengeance came out, doing diagnostics, getting logs from servers, analyzing reports. We've found and fixed several issues. We're continuing to find more. Specific reports there are super helpful. We go through the forums and see, hey, this person on this realm, this character name reported lag at 9:30 Central Time.
I've got a few
in
reports.
This zone, and we can actually look into the logs to see what was happening
whole
and maybe dig deeper to put in more hooks so we can identify the problems.
Okay.
It's an ongoing process. We're definitely not done. We understand, MMOs massively multiplayer and massive is important there, and there's nothing more fun and epic than some of those huge battles. And the challenge is always what in engineering terms is an n-squared problem, where if you have 20 people fighting 20 people, 20 times 20 is 400. That's sort of the overall number of events that are happening. 30 times 30, just going up by 10, is now 900, and then 1,600 for 40 versus 40, and so forth. So it scales very rapidly in ways that can tax our servers, but improving that is literally the top priority. And I think we're actually trying to, we'd like to get in the near future some sort of blog out from an engineering perspective, like a dev water cooler, explaining some of the problems we've already found and fixed, and the work that remains to be done, just to give some insight that I can't really provide as a non-engineer myself. But 100% agree, this is something that is of utmost importance to us.
Okay, great.
Cool. And like Ian said, specificity
awesome.
in these reports when we get it is super, super helpful. Things like where you were at the time, what were you doing, what's your character name, and so on. So that way, what time it was specifically. That way, our engineers can then look at the logs and say, okay, actually, we found the thing that happened that made our servers go crazy. Now we can actually track that down and fix it.
Because because a lot of the time, if it were a truly universal problem where everyone was experiencing it all the time, it would be much easier to track down in a lot of ways. But someone can have all of their logging in place. They can be running a debug client and log into the game, and actually things just perform fine. You can play for a couple of hours. I mean, I log in every night and often don't run into any issues. Then other times I find myself doing a world quest and I'm seeing significant server lag and responsiveness delays on my spells. And it's just the question of tracking down what the underlying cause is.
That's true. Okay, great.
Moving on. Next question comes from the Shoe Boots on Twitter, who asked, with cool Tyrants, Zandalari, and possibly more allied races coming to Azeroth, would you consider just letting us have all our character slots on a single realm?
Why not?
So the maximum...
Why not?
I think it's fairly well known at this point. The maximum number of characters that you can have total is 50, but currently the maximum you can have on a single realm is 18.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. It was, I think, 12, one per class before allied races were introduced.
Wait, how do you need more than 18
increasing
characters
it with each allied
on one
race
realm?
that's come out. I think this is a good point and a good question.
On one realm.
And thinking about it just in response to this,
so
I agree that makes sense. I'll talk to our team, but we probably should be able to just raise the cap all the way to 50 in 8.15 going forward with the new allied races.
Okay.
So if you have 50 characters in your account, sure, you can have them all on the same server. It doesn't seem like it should hurt anything.
Wow.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
Next question coming from BB Mezzi on Twitter, who says, can we get a way to transfer war resources from our main to our alts like we had in Legion?
I mean, nobody really cares about this, but you probably
this
should do it.
Also seems like it makes sense. That's something we probably can add just in 8.15. I think spend some more resources, get an account pack of resources, probably with a little bit of a inefficiency there that you can mail off to alts.
What the fuck? I
totally
love
understand
Blizzard
that
now.
if you have an alt that you primarily use for a specific activity, you're not necessarily doing as many world quests or emissaries on that character. You still want to engage the mission table. You're doing that stuff on your main and have spare. Why not? That's something we can do.
Okay.
Wow, back to back. Doing pretty well. All right.
Okay.
Here we go, Ian. Here's a question from Acris who says, can we get a Valor Point-like system which we can use to upgrade gear? Understand the argument for Titan Forge, but I've now went 7 weeks with no upgrade, as unless it Titan Forges, it's useless for the whole raid, not just myself.
Here we go.
Demoralizing system.
Come on, Ian.
So,
sadly, not 3 in a row. Sorry, Josh.
Damn.
Okay, so a few pieces to this. So I would assume, this question I assume was asked, at the end of the first raid tier, at the end of Uldir, at the end of the first season.
I think it came in right at the end of season 1.
I'm sure there's upgrades everywhere now. And to some extent, that's part of the natural cycle. It's always been the case. Before Titan Forging existed, even when Valor Points were present as an upgrade currency in Mist of Pandaria, when you're when you're in month 5 of a 5-month raid tier, you probably don't need a whole lot in the way of upgrades. And the way that used to work was just you go into a raid and boss 4 drops pants for me.
That's great. Yeah, I like that.
If I get my leggings, then I get my upgrade.
Okay.
We kill boss 4, he doesn't have my item. I'm getting nothing for the rest of the raid. That in and of itself could be demoralizing as well, especially when you're actually re-clearing to still progress on a later boss. And so Titan Forging, to some extent, was an answer to that problem, where there is the hope of continued power progression. You do have things to look forward to, some reason to be excited when you kill a boss and see what's on the corpse.
Excited.
Same, the chance for bonus sockets or tertiary stats like avoidance. Now, the problem with Valor Points that we had when we had the system in place for the first time in Mist, I think would still remain, even if you used it as a way of manually Warforging or Titan Forging your gear, is that it makes transitioning from one raid tier to the next awkward in a few ways. Because people raise the concern of the amount of inflation that we already have and the size of the jumps in item level from tier to tier.
Yes.
If, let's say, a normal mode raider would use Valor Points to Warforge or Titan Forge all of their gear over the course of multi-month tier, you'd effectively be going into the next tier geared at a level higher across the board, higher than the content that you're doing.
Right.
And that's different than random Titan Forges and Warforges. And I think Titan Forging is actually relatively uncommon compared to Legion.
I don't know about
the
that.
large Titan Forges, the people
what do you mean?
Make the rounds on Reddit of hey, I got a 395 piece from LFR that was plus 60 at level Titan Forge kind of
if you're
thing.
getting 395s, you're heroic geared.
If you have 1 or 2 pieces you got lucky on,
geared,
and you don't replace those pieces in the next tier, okay, that's fine to some extent. Early on, especially, you got lucky. The rest of the tier offers you upgrades. But if you're this is a very typical type of raider or raid group that does normal mode, progresses through normal mode meaningfully over the course of 2-3 months, then begins heroic, gets partway through heroic by the end of the tier, and then new raid comes out, they go into normal again.
Yeah.
If that group has Valor Point upgraded gear from the prior tier, 2 options. 1, we have much larger jumps where we have a 45 eye level jump instead of 30 from tier to tier, so that new content gives you rewards, because I think going in and killing a new boss for the first time, that group is a normal mode raid group that did some heroic at the end, but they're going to go into normal Battle of Dazara lore and struggle to learn those fights. Those are going to be meaningful progression for them. If you go through meaningful progression, kill a boss, and don't get an item that's an upgrade, that feels pretty bad. Alternately, we'd have to either have large jumps, or we accept what we did at times in Mists, where you'd get an item, and then just keep it in your bags for a while until you could Valor Point upgrade it enough to replace the current gear that you're wearing. That also feels bad.
Right.
So, long story short, that's part of the history. This isn't something that's off the table. I could actually see us doing something like this again, but I think it would make sense for the last tier of an expansion, where we have that somewhat longer tail. You're kind of rounding out your goals for the expansion,
That's not even
chasing perfection and completing your character. But we don't really have to worry in the same way about, okay, how do you replace this all next raid? When you're going into a whole new expansion after that, that's a very different story. We know that's a much fuller reset, and that can be managed differently. So,
okay, I do want to just something that has been popping in my mind as we've been going through this question. I do think it's interesting, the example of going 7 weeks without an upgrade, feeling really demoralizing, just from my rose-tinted Burning Crusade Classic Raider glasses. I'm looking at this and going, yeah, I remember farming Black Temple for a year plus for no upgrades. That was good because we needed glaives. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Comes from Shupu F413
but you did
on
it.
Twitter. And this actually ties into what you were talking about.
Old deer.
Yeah, so what's the reasoning behind the huge jump in power level between tiers? Wouldn't 370 normal, 385 heroic, and 400 mythic make more sense than the absurdity now? So
yes,
we're actually just talking a lot about something very closely related.
I think it's almost exactly the situation I just described. Yes. A group, so we've used 30 eye level jumps all through Legion for quite some time now.
And what did that do?
That was the smallest number that's still
5
guaranteed
million DPS.
upgrades. Like we want to minimize inflation. We don't want to just gratuitously throw tons of item levels out there for two reasons. One, introduces some scaling problems as ratings and things get really out of whack late in an expansion.
Yeah.
Also, it does risk invalidating and undermining your accomplishments in the short term if you feel like everything is just going to completely get blown away in a couple months when the new season comes out, when the new raid tier opens. So we want to keep it as low as possible, but not so low that there aren't upgrades. And so, so the folks that did normal Uldir and progressed into heroic Uldir, they had a fair number of 370s that they're wearing. If they started in Battle of Dazar Lore and you worked to get a new boss down and it dropped a 370 side grade for you,
right?
That's
that
an
would
LFR.
feel pretty bad. And so it's just kind of been a principle we followed really all the way back to Wrath of the Lich King. When you go into a new raid that is at your target difficulty, you should kill a boss for the first time, look at the things on its loot table, and feel excited and look at those upgrades.
LFR isn't their target difficulty if they were doing heroic Uldir.
That's what led us to this.
What do you mean?
Okay. Let's move on. A question comes from Felrin, who says, can PvP please get some sort of vendor? It feels like we're forced to PvE in order to PvP due to how important stats are again and how bad PvP drops are.
This
has been a super popular
This is one of our viewers.
PvP vendors. What are our thoughts there?
Yes.
Okay, so the reason why we have some of the problems with vendors, I think, are there's a certain level of obscurity. You PvP, you get this currency, you get these points, you get these badges, whatever they are, and there's a place you have to go in the world to spend them. It's not clear for someone who's looking to get into PvP exactly what these are meant for, what you're supposed to do with them. And
VIP
in practice, the way that system unfolded in the past was there was generally an order that you'd purchase your gear in. And we had things like rating requirements and total conquest requirements earned for the season to stop people from just buying the weapon first.
Felrin is a VIP of the channel.
The obvious right answer.
Felrin's VIP.
Everyone would be running around like a glass cannon with a great weapon and weak armor.
Good shit.
And so forth. But we understand
how stupid do you think your
value
players
of the
are?
Vendor is a feeling of control, a feeling that you can determine the path that you're going to gear your character in and what you're going to seek out when. The system that we're pursuing is recreating and trying to deliver all of those upsides, really, through a system that's a bit more transparent and just offers the rewards up front in the UI.
What do you mean transparent?
There's some significant improvements we feel like we've made in Season 2 compared to the first season. I think major complaints that we heard with the way the conquest schedule worked were, one, that there wasn't sufficient choice of Azurite pieces. Now when you unlock an Azurite quest reward from a given week of conquest progression, you'll have a choice of, I believe, 4 distinct pieces for that slot.
Yeah.
And with the new 5-ring armor, you're basically going to see every possible trait that your class can have represented somewhere there. So if there's a specific trait you're chasing, you can get that for sure. Similarly, when it's a non-weapon or trinket week, when it's, let's say pants or gloves or boots, we will offer you a choice of 4 different items. Let's say 2 bracers and 2 pairs of pants.
Why not
different
just
stats
have the
on them
vendor?
And different slots. So
are people really too stupid to use a vendor?
A great pair of pants that you got from some other source, or Lucky Warforged or whatever, don't get the pants, get the other slot instead. And if you're looking for a specific stat, get that stat. And then that's combined with the trophies that you can use to upgrade your gear to the appropriate rating. Every week of Conquest will also give you Quartermaster coins that give you a steady sense of progress towards earning those trophies. So ultimately, over the course of earning your Conquest points in a season, just as you could when there were vendors, you should be able to handpick the pieces that you want for given slots and have the ability to upgrade those in the long term to the appropriate item level
just give us
for the
a
rank
vendor,
that you're playing at. And so ultimately is that better than a vendor, it's different than a vendor, right?
No,
There's certainly
it's
more
not
control
better, it's
if there's just
worse.
everything that's out there on a
That's
vendor.
why if it was better, if it was different,
one difference
everybody
between
wouldn't be asking
the way
for a
PvP
vendor.
gear works now and the way it did back in the day is that now it's actually competing with the rest of our reward systems. When we had PvP vendors, we had stats like resilience and PvP power on that armor, which made it irrelevant and clearly not the correct choice for a raider to use or for someone who's trying to do other types of content.
I still use it.
Whereas now, it's all a single unified system. We think there's upsides there. It reduces the barriers to entry to PvP. If you want to get into PvP for the first time, you can take the gear that you've used from other parts of the game and just jump in and have fun as you learn the ropes. But one of the downsides to it is we do need to take the rest of the game into account in a fuller sense as we're designing the reward systems, because there isn't a raid vendor where you can just go buy all your raid loot. And we're trying to balance the desirability and attractiveness of those systems on the spectrum of rate of loot attainability and control. The PvP system actually probably offers by far the most control over getting the exact rewards that you want when you compare it to other endgame activities like Mythic Plus or endgame rating.
Okay.
And there were raid vendors.
I've just been thinking back through all the different ways that PvP
but you took
gearing
those
has
out
worked
of the
in the
game
past.
too.
I think the point you made about it all being
well, we
sort
have
of
to
tied
fuck
into the
this
same
up because we
general,
fucked the other
like,
thing up
rewards
too.
of
Now
rewards
everything's
thing
fucked.
is actually super important in a universe now. Like we've got world quests that you need to go out and do.
Give me
Something
a
like the
fucking
dual
break.
level system that we had in Warlords would be really, really weird for that, because like sure, if someone attacks you, all of a sudden you gain like 80 item levels and you're way better. But
nobody liked that.
So there are definitely downsides to the way the system has always had to work in the past. Hopefully we can get things to a point where everyone feels satisfied.
Yeah, and that's the goal. And I think, and if the question mentioned stats,
just add a vendor.
There are stats that are such outliers, especially in PvP. Like if you feel like mastery is so incredibly dominant that any piece that doesn't have mastery is useless to you, and some of the conquest schedule rewards don't have mastery on them, that's a problem we can attack from two different angles. One, by looking at the rewards themselves, but on the other hand, regardless of the context, whether it's raiding or whether it's arena, there shouldn't be such large disparities in our stats where some stats are effectively dead and some are mandatory. And so that's a problem we can attack from the class balance angle as well.
Yeah, I guess a good question to pose in terms of feedback would be, what choices do you feel you don't have in the current system?
Exactly that.
So
cool. That would be great to see. Moving on, question from Narillin on Twitter, who said, when are Mythic Plus seasons going to give rewards other than a hidden achievement? Pandaria and Warlords had some nice challenge mode rewards. BFA has nothing cool like that.
That's a good question.
So looking, obviously, Mythic Plus gives rewards that are item level focused and upgrades.
Tons of great gear, right? So I think challenge mode and Mists was and Warlords was exclusively a cosmetic system. You got nothing. You got no real items from it.
Yeah, good luck with that.
I think this is a great question. This is something that we should talk about. I think when we first introduced the Mythic Plus system in Legion, it wasn't clear. It was an experiment for Legion. At this point, we feel it was a very successful experiment, and it's increasingly being enshrined as a new pillar of our endgame alongside raiding and rated PvP. And in that sense, I think it makes sense to have some sort of, whether it's cosmetic rewards, titles, things that come out of it. Nothing specific to announce right now, but that's definitely a direction we should explore.
Okay. Cool. Moving right along. Next question from Brettel, who says, are there any plans on how to address the problem that some class mechanics are pretty much mandatory for high-level keystones, such as rogue shrouds? Why are there no crafting items that have the same effect, like with Bloodlust drums?
That is a good question.
Can we get drums of concealment? I'm not sure what we would call those.
Yeah, we could probably come up with something consumable. But so I think we made a hotfix just yesterday or the day before to invisibility potions. The invisibility potions are the consumable that lets you do skips that you otherwise would require a shroud for. The downside to them, of course, is that it locks out your other potion cooldowns for some period of time. We lowered that from 10 minutes to 5 minutes, which significantly reduces the tax, in a sense, on a high-end group that's relying on chain potting throughout the dungeon if they don't have a rogue.
So
now, we're not removing it entirely, and the reason why we're hesitant to expand this in terms of other consumables is we'd rather take the approach of finding other cool hooks for different classes that make them feel almost mandatory as well. Like ideally, there should be 7 or 8 different mechanics that feel as potent as Shroud, that all feel quote unquote mandatory, except you can only fit 3 or 4 of them in your group as you're forming it. And so that would affect how you tackle a dungeon, what you feel like you can choose, what you feel like you can't. And some of these are, not quite as universal as Shroud, but they exist. If you're doing,
I think Shroud's
King's Rest with a Death Knight, for example, who can control undead and a lot of the undead there to do things both like, to help manage CC, but also to control when you trigger the new Reaping affix, let's say, because you can let that mind control break at a time of your choosing to push yourself over the, over the 20% threshold. That could be a perk that opens up routing that isn't possible for someone who doesn't have that class present. Maybe Death Knights aren't the best example given their tank dominance at the high-end scene, but that's the sort of thing that we'd like to better approach. Now, that said, and yes, congratulations on your that said bingo.
I had that thought immediately.
Sorry,
as well.
It's really nothing that will break you of mannerisms of speech like Twitch chat and the internet. So appreciate that. No, it's true. Like
sounds good. Makes sense.
You're welcome.
Super
Ian.
conscious.
You're welcome.
It's certainly possible for certain mechanics to be too impactful, and some of that is a product of things like the enemy forces percent and overall routing in certain dungeons. If it feels like you're going to get to 115% enemy forces without skips, and you just, no matter what you do, and you need to use Shroud, you need to invis in order to have anything, it's shaving off multiple minutes of your run. That's something where we probably should also be looking at the enemy forces percent. And so getting a sense of which dungeons are the biggest outliers there, where you're going way over without large skips.
Problem solved.
Would also be helpful feedback on
there
that front,
it is.
something we're keeping an eye on. So I think certainly there may be times where using a skip to pick some mobs over others,
I've never done
right?
that
Where you're
Plus.
skipping, and
Wasted
now
time.
the mandatory mobs aren't going to get you to 100%, so you're going to go pull extra things.
Right.
But that's very different when it's your choice to do that versus you're just going to have to kill extra things if you don't skip.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of ties into something I was going to ask you about as well, being you mentioned invisibility potions as kind of the semi-substitute for rogue shrouds, but obviously you can still use both.
Yes.
But if the enemy forces is more of a factor, then using both doesn't really get you anything, because then it doesn't get you as much anyway.
Exactly. I
mean, it gives you more choice in which mobs you fight.
In the original design of Mythic Plus, enemy forces was almost there as a counter to all stealth group strats of Guardian Druid, Resto Druid, and Rogue Druid DPS.
That'd be
just
funny.
Skip everything.
Yeah.
And ideally, it should be more closely calibrated to the number of mobs that you normally must kill if you're just trying to walk through without stealth or skips.
Okay.
Right.
And where there's a significant disparity, we should address that.
Okay. Cool. Next question comes from Raging Wolf, who says, will there ever be a way to punish players that abandon Keystone runs midway?
Raging Wolf,
it's frustrating when pugs frequently apply, then bail during the progression of the key, wanting a free carry. So I actually remember back very early Legion when it was changed, because it used to be that right when Legion first came out, it used to be that if someone left a Keystone run, they still got loot or something like that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Or they didn't. I don't remember exactly how it was, but there was some sort of change that was made that made it so that I remember what it was now. Actually, it was people who we were having a problem with, like someone disconnects on the last fight in Legion or something, and then now they don't get anything for the entire run because they disconnected at some point. Even if they disconnected and reconnected, like they still would miss out or something. So I remember there being a change.
There were a few early bugs, and then I think there's loot protection to make sure that if someone if you DC on the final boss fight, you don't get nothing, which is the same way raid bosses work and other aspects of the game. We want to make sure that if you earn the loot, you get the loot. So the underlying question here is challenging, right? I'm sure in some dystopian future MMO world where we're all playing with VR haptics, you can give the person an electric shock, and then you can feel good about just punishing them. But other than that, it's hard for us to punish people in a social situation, right? Punishment makes sense and works in random match-made situations, right? That's what Deserter is literally there for. If you join a dungeon group through LFG and you don't like the group, and you're like, all right, I'm leaving, I'm going to bail on them and force them to wait and struggle, you're stuck with Deserter to try to disincentivize that behavior. Ultimately, Mythic Plus, just like pickup group raids and other non-matchmade activities, there is a social contract there. And I recognize that when you're dealing with relatively anonymous people, that social contract is maybe weaker. And I think that's one of the strongest arguments, in MMOs in general for forming stronger social bonds, for making friends, for adding that tank to your friends list, for finding that good rogue or whatever that that you've played with before, had a good time, that isn't going to just bail on you, because the penalty for bailing on you is a social one. It's, well, they're not going to invite you to group anymore if you were just a jerk and you left.
Wow.
And us trying to objectively come up with a system here would likely run into other problems. Because sometimes, sometimes there are runs that actually should be abandoned. If folks are in over their head and a group is trying to do, a high keystone that someone is very determined that they want to get done, but the group clearly isn't handling the mechanics and has wiped multiple times very early on in the dungeon, it's totally reasonable for someone to look at this and say, hey, I don't have 2 hours. Like, literally, I have to go do something. I don't have 2 hours to sit here and play through this whole dungeon and wipe 30 times.
There it is.
I'm going to leave. And it's hard to imagine us finding an objective way to punish that person for making that decision that doesn't also open tons of loopholes. And so I think that's just where things stand.
Too
when you
fucking
have
bad,
Raging
Wolf.
Groups, and that's the
Grow
social
a
aspect
dick
of dungeons
and make
and
some
raids when it comes to that.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of people suggesting an idea of like a quote-unquote karma system, and there's even been, I think, a couple of add-ons and websites that have tried to do something like that, but they end up being very, very... they end up having a lot of the same problems that we've seen in the past with things like gear score, or even nowadays with IO scores, where people say, okay, your score isn't high enough, so therefore you can't come, which then in turn means that you don't get invited, and you can never fix it.
That's something that we talked about a lot that we'd like to explore, though. I think there's, in other, you see what Overwatch and other games do, the ability to just kind of give a thumbs up or a like or an upvote at the end of a run.
Okay.
It's, like you said, it's easier said than done. There's something appealing about a way of being able to see, look at a player that you've never played with and know, okay, a lot of other people have highly recommended this person. Right? It's the same way when you call an Uber or Lyft, you can see their star rating.
Just have
because
third-party
tons of other drivers,
do
other passengers thought this driver was
good.
Don't
do this yourself.
It gives you an added sense of trust. Doing that in a way that's not going to be manipulated and not going to lead to negative social outcomes, that's the challenge. But that's something we talk about a lot that we'd love to get done one day.
Oh,
cool.
Come on. It's never going to
work,
work,
let's move on. Question here from Wasselin, who says,
that's not me.
The transmog in BFA leaves a lot to be desired. When are you bringing back class-specific sets? One set for each armor type is not enough.
So I think, obviously, this is taste is subjective when it comes to this. We're taking a break from the traditional class sets in BFA. That's not necessarily a permanent break.
People is
it's
actually
quite
less
possible
than
we'll go back to doing class sets in the future. I think we're doing it for a few reasons.
Crazy.
It's not actually because Azerite armor is replacing it. That could have worked with traditional class set art without a problem. It's actually more a conscious decision to add more variety. We don't just, the key thing is we don't just have one class-specific set. So at times in the past, in WoW, we would make 12 sets, one for each class, or however many classes we had at the time.
Right.
There'd be a variant, perhaps a color variant a lot of the time for PvP. And then maybe more recently the Mythic version would have some extra visual effects and geometry attached to it. But almost all of the gear from all of these sources shared the same look. And so that actually led to a certain monotony there. Similar, and also we were going down the road of having our artists take their 21st or 22nd or 23rd crack at like what is the priest fantasy, what is the mage fantasy.
Well, if they're running out of ideas,
which also often came at the expense of feeling connected to the place where that gear came from. So one of the reasons why we tried in the past doing armor that felt themed to a certain place.
In Throne of Thunder.
But how do you make the mage set that comes from a demon raid that doesn't feel like a warlock set? Because if it's like, if it feels all arcane and fire and frost, then that's not demonic or fel. If it feels fel, then it's a fel caster set that looks warlock. So instead, we have a variety of different sets. Right? If you look at the PvP armor, if you look at what comes from Warfronts, if you look at what comes from Uldir versus Battle of Dazar Lore, those are all meaningfully distinct sets that feel like they're connected to where they came from and actually are offering a wider variety of transmog options. And if you recall back in Legion, Emerald Nightmare gear, those were recolors of Nighthold gear. There weren't two separate gear sets and looks for Emerald
there were
Nightmare
12
versus Nighthold, whereas Uldir and Battle of Dazar Lore have completely different art. And so that's what we're trying to chase now. We're actually trying to offer more variety in transmog options. Rather than the 20-second take on what a cool Warlock set might be, let's give you a cool cloth voodoo-themed set and one that's more Titan-themed and one that's deeply themed after your faction.
Awesome.
And one that is, Naga, coral-encrusted jewels coming from Rise of Ashara next tier. There are more directions we can explore there.
Okay.
Are we going to stay there forever? Definitely not saying we are. So I think it's quite possible we go back to class sets, but that's the logic for why it works the way it does in BFA.
Okay, so it's just let's just try something new for a little while. Khadgar head in a bubble.
And I mean, new, but I think hopefully better. This is an example of change for the sake of change.
Temps.
It's actually wanting to offer
challenge
more
modes in Pandaria.
meaningful variety than just
Do all Mythic
giving
plus 15s,
arena
plus 10s,
rewards,
you get a new set
recolor of
for
the
your
raid
class.
rewards, or having
Boom, there it
all
is.
raid loot look the same,
Easy.
etc.
I love that.
You mentioned Rise of Azshara just a second ago, which leads us into this question pretty well. Galkresh asked, can we get more information about the direction you're taking the Heart of Azeroth and the systems that will be in place for 8.2 and beyond? So just before the holiday break, we had a Q&A.
All right.
You talked a little bit about some changes to the Heart of Azeroth that we're planning for the Rise of Azshara update. Is there anything more that we can share about that at this point?
A bit more. So I think I don't want to get too much into the details because a lot of the design is still under iteration, in very active discussion, and we're figuring out the details of it. But big picture, we want to move away from unlocking the same sets of traits on new pieces of armor as you get them. So in Rise of Azshara and beyond, you'll still have your 3 Azerite armor pieces. They'll still have the 5 rings that they have today, except the heart requirements for those pieces will not continue to increase. So when you get a new helm from the Azshara raid, it'll just have all the traits selectable. You can mix and match to your liking. And we'll have new traits that are specific to the new zones, and that will continue as it has been. Instead, what you'll earn by continuing to level up your Heart of Azeroth is something a bit more akin to how Legion artifacts work, where the amulet itself has powers that can be unlocked, customized, and chosen among.
How do you unlock them?
One of the things that we liked about the way the Legion artifacts work was actually the appearances that you could unlock by doing different types of content. We're looking at tying some of the heart powers that you can earn for the heart permanently into different types of content and rewards. Maybe there's one that you get from raiding and defeating Azshara, one that you get from emissaries, one that you get from PvP, one that you get from reputations, one that you get from Mythic Plus, and so on and so forth. As you earn these different powers, you can activate them, upgrade them, and these would include active abilities in many cases, so that you can actually, imagine holding your Heart of Azeroth out and firing a beam of Azerite energy at an enemy, or shielding your group in and out with an Azerite bubble.
Well, that's cool.
Like things that are more reminiscent of the fantasy of the Legion artifact weapons and actually add to gameplay rather than just being passive modifications.
Fuck yeah.
So that's big picture what we're looking at.
That's awesome.
And again, the philosophy behind this is, I think I mentioned this a bit in the last Q&A.
Yeah.
One of our big criticisms of how the Azerite system has worked out thus far is this inherent tension of artifact power and the type of system and the progression feels best when you're working towards an exciting goal.
Yes.
However, because we're using items as our delivery vehicle for those traits, it would feel pretty crappy to have the strongest Azerite power be the things at the center of the wheel that you couldn't use initially, because then that would undermine the feeling of getting a new reward. When you go into a raid and you kill a new boss, you get a pair of shoulders. Cool, if I put this on, I'm going to lose all of my best stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep it in my bags for a few more weeks until I can unlock it.
Sure.
That led us to put the gameplay modifying abilities on the outer ring, so you have them right away. But then that undermines the feeling of artifact power feeling like an interesting progression or a meaningful reward. So we're getting away from that, and you'll work towards permanent unlocks and just carrying your character forward through this parallel system that will complement Azerite as it currently stands.
Awesome. I'm super excited to learn more about that once it's
next expansion.
Further along in development. But that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Moving on, next question from Azamane, who says, are there any plans to further curb Titan Residuum funneling? Still fairly easy for organized guilds to run single armor type raids and stockpile tons of Residuum for next season. So basically talking about we're going to run a raid where everybody wears plate, and all of the plate-wearing people in the raid, then any Azerite pieces they get, they trade them over to this person. That person can then turn them into Titan Residuum.
Yeah. So I think fairly easy is probably a relative term. I think fairly easy for world top 10 guilds who have streamers with hundreds of Twitch followers. Yes, they can probably fill their raids and do this a bit more easily. So we made a change last week, I believe, to make it so that you can't disenchant or scrap the wrong material type. Like if you're a hunter, you shouldn't have cloth Azerite. There's no reason why you'd ever have this in your possession other than someone giving it to you specifically to funnel.
That's smart.
So that shouldn't give Residuum.
Yeah, I like that.
Throws up an extra barrier there. Beyond that, we don't want to make changes that are going to hurt the majority of players and innocent gameplay for the sake of a tiny minority of the very high-end raiders that are doing this.
Is there anybody
what we do try to do is to curb the advantage that high-end extreme behavior can produce. Like, we understand very top guilds that are trying to push for, world firsts, realm, region firsts, Hall of Fame, they will go to extreme lengths, and they've always done this to prepare and to compete.
Well, then
and they're
going to
put in a lot of time. And so I don't think there's anything that we could do that would make Method not spend 40, 50 hours a week in the weeks leading up to a new tier to prepare their characters. They're just going to do what
50?
they think is the most efficient use of their time. If we completely remove this, they would spend that time leveling and gearing more alts for class stacking so that they can bring 5 rogues to one fight and 5 warlocks to another and 5 hunters to another.
Man.
And that would still seem like an advantage over other guilds. Maybe not something that they consider necessarily fun, but it's in pursuit of a competitive goal that they do consider fun and worthwhile to pursue. What we've tried to do, though, is to reduce the gap in power between people who do those extreme behaviors and the more mainstream groups that are just playing the game, gearing up, focusing on their mains, and doing things more naturally.
Yeah.
And all of this, and I think that's what the residuum inflation from tier to tier actually helps do. We basically went up 10. We went up 10x in terms of the costs from season 1 to season 2 and the rewards.
That's a lot.
So when people open their weekly mythic chest next Tuesday, next Wednesday if you're in Europe, Thursday if you're in Asia, you'll get, if you did a 10 or higher, you're going to see 625, 650 or more residuum. That would have been multiple weeks worth of residuum in season 1.
Oh, I do 10.
And so all of this funneling really just adds up to a 1 or 2 week head start in the season, which gives you 1 extra piece of gear. Yes, that's an advantage. That's an advantage that's very quickly going to fade away and actually pales in comparison to what traditional split rating was doing for guilds in past tiers.
Oh, yeah.
Where you'd literally be able to funnel, 5 or 6 weeks worth of heroic raid loot into one player, and that advantage would take months in some cases for regular guilds to overcome. So, anyway, TLDR, nothing further planned.
We don't give a fuck.
This is something that's only being done by a tiny sliver of the player base, and we don't want to hurt average players just to curb this behavior when top guilds are just going to find some other outlet if we do.
Fucking great.
Okay. Let's move on then. Next question comes from Jito, who says, what do you consider the biggest design challenges that WoW is facing in the long term from a development point of view? So got a very, very top-level view sort of question here.
I could talk for a really long time about this. To be fair, I can talk for a long time about anything. But anyway.
I'm glad you said it.
Yeah, you're all thinking it. So it's a lot of dichotomies, a lot of just contradictions and tensions between opposing considerations. It's resolving short-term versus long-term, resolving casual versus hardcore, resolving, elegance and accessibility versus depth and complexity. I think WoW's a game that has so many different audiences and then subdivisions within those audiences.
Yeah.
There's a ton of different play styles. Like I think you could take a dozen people who all play WoW a lot and love WoW and sit them around a table and have them talk to each other about their experiences, and it would almost seem like they were each describing a different game.
That's probably true.
Whether you are somebody who is an altaholic versus a collector versus someone who just loves queuing up for BGs and pew-pewing on your hunter versus someone who doesn't see any point to the game other than pushing for Gladiator every season and everything else is in service of that goal versus the Raider versus and so on and so on and so forth.
That's true.
I think part of the magic of WoW is that
pew pew.
It's a tapestry that combines all of these play styles and all these groups. I think the game is richer for having all of them in it than it would be if we just picked one audience to cater to. It would be much easier to pick one audience to cater to.
Yeah, totally.
And we could solve a lot of their problems. And if we're, if a lot of the time when players express frustration or disappointment at decisions we're making,
come on,
they're like, "Why? This just seems so simple. Why don't you change the game in this way? It'll make us happy." It's not that we don't want to make you happy. It's that there's 10 other groups that have different competing concerns that would be hurt by that. And so play styles are one factor. I mean, touching on questions that we've talked about earlier on in this Q&A, things like catch-up, things like inflation from tier to tier. This is something that's been a problem in WoW for a long, long time. Yes, back in 2005, we didn't have these robust catch-up mechanisms. And I remember, leading a raid guild in Burning Crusade and having one of our top raiders from Classic come back when we were pretty deep into Black Temple who wanted to, get into raiding. And it was like, all right, time to start. Do we run Serpent Shrine and Tempest Keep for this guy again and get them geared up? And yes, on the one hand, that made that gear feel more meaningful. On the other hand, it was this huge barrier to returning players and accessibility. And how would people feel?
Accessibility.
Yes, we worry about undermining your current accomplishments.
Yes.
But when Rise of Ashara comes out, and someone is like, all right, I haven't played BFA in a few months, but I can't wait to go check this new thing out that's awesome, or I want to go rejoin my guild and play with them.
The A word.
If they actually have to play for 2 or 3 months doing old content that feels irrelevant to the current player base because, you know, it's yesterday's news just to get caught up, maybe that person doesn't have a good time at all. Maybe that person feels like they can't rejoin your guild.
Yeah,
all of those
things.
It's
much better for them to do the content in a week than quit
challenges.
again, right?
And there's
That's
countless
great.
more examples. I think those are the biggest design challenges facing WoW in the long term, because a lot of them are unique to WoW. There isn't an analogous game that we can look to. It's like, all right, this is how they've managed 15 years of history, and continuing to keep things elegant and accessible while also satisfying those who've been playing it for 15 years and want something new and exciting and additional depth.
Yeah, that's true.
We certainly don't do a perfect job. I will never for a second admit that we are, but that's what we grapple with. They're fun questions, but they're hard questions. And we've been doing a lot of thinking and internal discussion about that going forward. I think there have been a lot of good points raised in the community. You know, it's very easy for us to err in going too far in one direction versus the other, whether that's, you know, accessibility, whether it's gear catch-up, whether it's the importance of gear and the investment you have in the items that you're wearing, or whatever else. You know, I think on class design, for example, you know, I think for a while we had it as, for many years actually, I think we had it as a sort of an internal, just almost a truism that we had agreed upon as a design team, that our classes they didn't need more added to them, that if we added anything, we needed to remove something. And this is a Blizzard philosophy that you've seen in a lot of other places. Like when StarCraft made their expansions, when even like StarCraft 1 or StarCraft 2, they didn't just strictly add a whole bunch of new units. The design team took the approach of, okay, for everything we add, we're going to remove something because we're trying to manage the overall scope and complexity and accessibility of the system.
Unit, I remember that.
That may be a good principle for making a brand new standalone game, but we maybe are underserving folks who have played a class for a dozen years and really just want something new, even if it does make it a bit unwieldy. Maybe we should be giving that to them. And so these questions are still open. You know, just because we've done something for a few years and taken a certain path doesn't mean that we're always going to take that path. We constantly are reevaluating, reexamining the decisions we're making, and making sure they're the best thing for our player base as a whole, and really for the dozen different player bases we effectively have and are trying to all balance against each other.
And I actually think what you were talking about earlier about the Heart of Azeroth stuff that we're considering for Rise of Azshara is actually a really good example of what you were just talking about. The idea of, we had the artifact in Legion that was taken away with Battle for Azeroth, but now we're looking back at that system and going, actually, maybe we should keep some of that. Maybe we should bring some of that back into the.
That's a good idea.
So that's really super interesting. I would actually love to hear you talk about that for a million years, but we've got a bunch more questions, and a few of them I'd really like to get to.
All right, let's do it.
This one comes from Scar Totem on Twitter, who said, what conversations have been held about the GCD change, and are you generally happy with how it's played out? I know that the GCD has been an ongoing thing throughout all of Battle for Azeroth so far, and we've brought a lot of stuff back off the GCD, made some changes to things.
Yeah, happy is a strong word. I mean, I think we definitely feel like we went too far, which is why we've been reining it in over the course of both the later stages of the beta and more recently with a lot of the movement abilities.
Ever since the first day you announced it.
We think that we're not done. We think that having the GCD, the global cooldown, being closer to global and having most abilities obey it is a better place overall for the pace of the game to be, in terms of minimizing macros, in terms of managing the decision-making that you're making in the moment-to-moment gameplay.
Okay.
Now, just putting a bunch of things back on the GCD, we've realized a lot of those buttons feel unsatisfying to press. That includes a lot of the offensive cooldowns. So some work in internal discussion that we're doing right now is trying to solve those problems more surgically on an individual basis. And an example of a change that I think is likely coming in 8.15 that should be in a future PTR build is like take Shaman Ascendance as an ability. Right now, you just push that. It's a GCD. You transform. That's kind of cool, but you're basically doing nothing. It's purely a modal shift. And especially as a healer, you may feel like you're actually now behind on the emergency situation you were trying to respond to in a way that can be frustrating. Well, what if we added an active component to that, so that when you turn into an Ascendant, you emitted a wave of healing water around you, doing this big burst AoE splash heal as you transformed, and then you were an Ascendant for the next 15 seconds with the bonuses that entails. Like, what if we start to take that approach and apply it to more other abilities? That sort of thing can make those buttons while on the GCD feel more satisfying to press while on the GCD.
Okay.
So I think the answer to this button feels bad to press isn't, I don't think, okay, just take it off the GCD so you can just press it and not really, you don't even feel pressing it. You're just almost combining it with another action. It's let's look at why it doesn't feel satisfying to press and fix that.
Okay.
Fuck
Sorry, I've been thinking about a lot of what you were saying just there.
That's awesome.
We've been going through this and actually looking through a couple of the questions we've got coming up. We actually have a few things about class questions. I'm just going to actually move on to this next one because I think it's really interesting and maybe part of the general philosophy here comes from, it's actually another one from Wasselin who said, as a healer main, I find myself feeling forced into a DPS spec more and more, even in group content such as Islands and Warfronts. Are you trying to get away from the Holy Trinity design? And can healers get higher DPS in PvE?
Dude. No, come on.
So I think we are the Holy Trinity design, referring to the tank, healer, DPS, core dungeon gameplay that goes all the way back to EverQuest and beyond. We're not trying to get away from it broadly. I think we're definitely trying to experiment with different types of gameplay. Outdoor world gameplay traditionally has never really gravitated around this, and scenarios, islands don't. Our goal is to have there be advantages to being able to play your role in each of these situations. If you are a healer on an island, that should mean that your group mates can pull much more aggressively, and that you have some advantages when you're matching up against the enemy AI, because you can be a bit more reckless, you have much more sustainability, you should feel like you're contributing in that role. Now, is a 3-healer group going to do great on an island? Probably not, but that's also relatively unlikely. If you feel like being a healer in Warfronts is irrelevant, then that probably speaks more to the amount of damage that's going out in Warfronts and just the level of challenge that's being posed. Yes, if no one's health bar is moving down, then it doesn't make sense to be a healer. Healer DPS, I think it's much higher than it used to be years and years past. I think there's a point where once you cross a threshold compared to a regular damage dealer, especially because healer DPS rotations are very simple. Like, damage dealing rotations often involve
healers are easy.
Multiple abilities reacting to procs, and you have to play them perfectly. Healer DPS rotations are usually just a couple of buttons because primarily you're a healer.
So it's Burning Crusade or Wrath.
Very low skill ceiling healer rotation is actually 80% of someone who's a mediocre DPS player.
Right.
Now that actually undermines the role of DPS in the game, because the healer is also has all this awesome sustainability and utility, and so there's a certain line we're not happy to cross. Personally, I do most of my world quests as a healer, and it's a little bit slower than being DPS, but with Warmode on, there's also a lot of value in feeling like I have much more sustainability if I run into a solo PvP encounter.
Why?
So there's a balance there. I think some specs maybe could use some more help.
I don't know about that.
If we push the line too far, you end up with where Disc Priests were at the start of the expansion, where it felt like they were just unkillable gods, and Shadow Priests were switching to Disc, even if they didn't normally heal, just because that felt like the right way to DPS.
Isn't that the discipline class fantasy, though, being an unkillable god? Isn't that kind of...
Sure. That's everyone's class fantasy, really.
No, it's only warriors.
Yeah.
All the rest of the classes
All right.
just suck.
Question here from Jfunk Gaming on Twitter, asking, are there any major class changes in the works for 815? We've talked about a couple of, what we would call more minor changes, like the Ascendance sort of thing you were talking about. Are we planning any huge, massive things for 815?
No major overhauls, no. Focused, looking at talent balance, looking at specific abilities that could use some love.
There it is, boys. There it is.
Pure balance is likely to happen just via hotfix. I think we're looking at data coming in from the first week of the new raid and that other content. I think Arms Warriors there in particular could definitely use some love. That's one that I know the team has discussed a lot.
I hate Arms.
Not sure exactly what else is in the pipeline off the top of my head.
Just get rid of it. Make Arms PvP.
Yeah, so I think in Legion, 7.15 ended up being the patch with a ton of major changes. That's because 7.1 came so soon on the heels of Legion that was actually pretty much in the can by the time Legion had come out. There wasn't time to make class changes responding to what we were seeing in the live game. Whereas 8.1, coming 5 or so weeks later in the cycle, actually gave us that time. And so there were some significant changes that made it into that patch. I think Feral Druids and their ability to AoE and to hold their own much more in dungeons, I think, are an example of the sort of change we're talking about there.
Okay.
Several of the, there are a couple of examples where feedback that we gets more to the heart of a class's or a spec's resource system or the fundamental nature of the rotation. those types of changes are likely going to have to wait until the next expansion. Those aren't the sorts of changes we generally make out from under you in a patch, just because, again, that's looking at the wide variety of audiences. For the average player logging into a new patch and finding that your entire resource system has changed, or that multiple buttons that you were accustomed to pressing no longer exist or have different names, that goes beyond what really should be expected ever in a patch.
Okay. Yeah, and one thing that I want to make sure that we point out as we're talking about this question here too is the term major class changes means a different thing to absolutely everybody.
Yeah, obviously.
I think a while back in a Q&A prior to the launch of BFA, we were talking about, okay, there's not going to be any major class changes for Shaman as an example until we were at that time looking at 8.1. And then in our minds, as we had been discussing, the major changes were like, okay, we need to buff and debuff and change how abilities damage flow works and everything. Yeah. Which we ended up doing a bunch of, but it's clear from what we said at the time that a lot of Shaman players were expecting a complete overhaul of their spec in that patch, and so that was a bit of a miscommunication there. So that's just why I wanted to make that point here.
Yeah, and I would say,
and it happens the other way around too sometimes, where we say, yeah, no major class changes planned for 8.15, and then something like the Ascendance change you were just talking about goes in, and then people go, "What you said? There were no major changes. This is huge."
Yeah, when we say major, I think we mean rotational overhauls, resource overhauls. Things like adding Maelstrom, removing Maelstrom, removing Holy Power from a spec. Like, that's not something that's going to happen in a patch.
Warriors alive.
That it's both because of the magnitude of the change in terms of player expectation, but also the amount of time to test those changes and get feedback on them exceeds what any patch PTR cycle would ever give us. That's more the kind of thing for an expansion beta.
Right. Okay. So not going to completely change your spec to feel like something different entirely, but there is still some balance stuff, and the balance has been ongoing through hotfixes as well. Yep. All right, I think we have pretty much run out of time, so that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Ian, for coming on here and answering these questions.
Pleasure as always.
It's been fantastic. And hopefully we've gotten some really good information out there for you guys as well. We do have more Q&As obviously being planned at this point in time.
Please do more. I need more content.
Trying to keep that content coming as quickly as possible, so keep an eye out for more announcements in the very near future. What's going to be happening. We're also going to be looking into doing more of the sort of like dev chat style things like what we did with Taryn and Steve a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that was great.
So I actually, personally, I would love to hear what sort of aspects of the development team that you're not hearing from on these Q&As that you'd like to hear more from. Like you were talking about engineers earlier with stuff like server latency. I personally think it'd be really interesting to learn from those guys what it is that they do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm up here trying to get out as much information as I can on a regular basis, but there's a giant team of nearly 300 folks who have all these awesome areas of expertise that I couldn't begin to speak to that we'd love to be able to share with you.
Awesome. So yeah, let me know what sort of topics you'd like to see covered there. Let us know. In the meantime, thanks again, everybody, for hanging out.
Looking forward to the world first race next week in Mythic. That's going to be a fun time in Battle of Zandalari. We'll see who takes home the crown.
Okay,
I'm pretty sure you just finished someone's bingo, actually. Pretty sure you just finished someone's bingo. There you go. Thanks for hanging out, everybody.
Purely coincidental. I had no idea there was even a bingo.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Later, guys.
See ya.
Cucked again. I can't believe it. It's a sucking. Once more, Blizzard has cucked me. I ask a question, they don't give a fuck. It doesn't matter. The volume, I'm gonna turn it down. Okay, there we go. Volume's better. It's disappointing, man. What was your question? I asked, why does the game suck so much dog dick? And they didn't answer that one either. And then I asked, how big is Archimonde's dick? That I still haven't gotten a response from that.